He buried his wife alive by accident. The message he received 10 years later drove him to the brink of madness. Carlos looked at the clock for the 100th time. 7:15 a.m. Ana was still sleeping, unaware of what was about to happen. He took a sip of his coffee, now cold, and ran a hand through his graying hair. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the relentless ticking of the wall clock. "Come on, Carlos, it's now or never," he said to himself. He stood up, his knees creaking in protest, and walked to the bedroom. Ana was lying on her back, her dark hair spread out on the pillow. For a moment, Carlos hesitated. "No," he murmured. "I can't go on like this." He approached the bed and gently shook Ana's shoulder. "Honey, wake up," he said, his voice tense. Ana stirred, slowly opening her eyes. "Carlos, what time is it? It's early." "I know, but we have to go. I have a surprise for you." Ana sat up, rubbing her eyes. "A surprise? What are you talking about?" Carlos forced a smile. "Get dressed, I'll explain on the way." While Ana got ready, Carlos checked his bag one last time. The shovel, the ropes, the sedatives, everything was there. He zipped it shut, his hands trembling. "Where are we going?" asked Ana, appearing at the bedroom door. "You'll see," Carlos replied, avoiding her gaze. "It's a special place." The car ride was tense. Carlos drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Ana looked at him sideways, worried. "Carlos, you're very quiet. Is everything all right?" He nodded mechanically. Yes, just concentrating on the road." "Are you sure you don't want me to drive?" "No," Carlos exclaimed, startling her. Then more softly, "No, thank you. I'm fine." After an hour, Carlos stopped the car on a dirt road surrounded by dense forest. "What is this place?" Ana asked, looking around confused. Carlos took a bottle of water from the glove box. "Here, you must be thirsty." Ana accepted the bottle and took a long drink. "Thanks, but seriously, Carlos, what are we doing here?" Carlos didn't answer. He watched in silence as Ana's eyes began to lose focus. "Carlos, I feel strange," Ana murmured before collapsing onto the seat with a trembling sigh. Carlos got out of the car and opened the trunk. He took out the shovel and began walking towards the forest. After a few minutes, he reached a clearing where the earth had been recently moved. He returned to the car and pulled out Ana's inert body. He carried her to the clearing and laid her down beside the hole he had dug the night before. "I'm sorry, Ana," he whispered, "but I can't live like this anymore." He started digging, widening the hole. Sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with the tears he couldn't hold back. Suddenly he heard a moan. Ana was waking up. No, Carlos muttered, speeding up his work. Ana opened her eyes slowly, disoriented. "Carlos? Where?" Her eyes focused on the shovel, the hole in Carlos's distraught face. Panic flooded her. "Carlos, what are you doing?" she screamed, trying to get up. Carlos dropped the shovel and lunged at her, pinning her down. "I'm sorry, Ana. I'm so sorry." "Carlos, please don't do this," Ana pleaded, struggling. "I can't take it anymore, Ana. I can't live with this lie." "What are you talking about, Carlos? You're scaring me." Carlos loosened his grip, sitting down beside Ana. His face was a mask of pain and guilt. "I know everything, Ana. I know about you and Miguel." Ana paled. "Carlos, No! Don't lie anymore," Carlos yelled. "I saw you. In our bed. In our house. How could you?" Tears streamed down Ana's face. "I'm sorry, Carlos. It was a mistake. A fling. Please, we can fix this. We can go to therapy. We can fix it." Carlos interrupted with a bitter laugh. "How do you fix something like that? How can I ever trust you again?" "Give me a chance, Carlos, please. I'll do anything." Carlos stood up, picking up the shovel. "It's too late, Ana. I've been planning this for months. I can't move on knowing what you did." Ana tried to stand up, but her legs were still weak from the sedative. "Carlos, please, think about what you're doing. This isn't you. And how do you know who I am, Ana? Clearly you don't know me as well as you thought." "I know you, Carlos. You're a good man. You're not a murderer." Carlos paused, the shovel trembling in his hands. For a moment, Ana thought she had reached him. "You're right, Ana. I'm not a murderer." Ana let out a sigh of relief. But today I will become one. With that, Carlos hit her with the shovel. Ana fell to the ground, dazed but conscious. Carlos, no! Please! Carlos dragged her toward the hole. Ana resisted, clawing at the dirt, clinging to roots. Help! Somebody help me! She screamed desperately. No one can hear you, Ana. We're alone here. With a final push, Carlos managed to get Ana into the hole. She looked at him from the bottom, her eyes filled with terror and pleading. Carlos, please! I love you! We can get through this! Carlos picked up the shovel and started throwing dirt on top of her. No, Carlos! No, don't! Ana screamed, trying to climb the walls of the hole. The dirt fell on her, covering her legs, her torso. Ana coughed and spat, struggling to stay afloat in the sea of earth. Our children, Carlos. Think about our children. Carlos paused. I'll tell them you abandoned them, that you couldn't bear the guilt and left. No, Carlos, please, I beg you. But Carlos continued to throw dirt. Ana's screams became muffled, desperate. Her hand emerged from the earth, clutching at the air, searching for help. Carlos watched as Ana's fingers twitched, waved, and finally lay still. With the last shovelfuls of dirt, he completely covered his wife's body. He dropped to his knees beside the makeshift grave, gasping. The silence of the forest was deafening. Only his ragged breathing and the occasional song of a bird, oblivious to the tragedy that had just occurred, could be heard. Carlos looked at his hands covered in dirt and blood. The reality of what he had just done hit him like a sledgehammer. Oh my God, he murmured. What have I done? He stood up shakily and walked toward a nearby tree. He leaned against the trunk and vomited violently. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked toward the grave. There was no turning back. Ana was dead, buried by his own hands. He was a murderer. Carlos picked up the shovel and started covering up the evidence. He smoothed out the earth, scattered leaves and branches over the area. He worked mechanically, his mind blank, unable to process what he had just done. When he finished, the clearing looked untouched. No one could guess that under that ground lay Ana's body. Carlos went back to the car, threw the shovel in the trunk, and sat behind the wheel. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His eyes were empty, dead. He started the engine and began to drive back to the city. He had to think of an alibi, what he would tell the children, Ana's family, the police, when they inevitably asked about her. As he drove, Ana's words echoed in his mind. Carlos, please, I love you. We can get through this. But it was too late. Love had died, buried in that forest clearing along with Ana. Carlos pressed down on the accelerator. He had a new life ahead of him, a life built on a lie and a heinous crime. But it was the only life he had left now. The car disappeared down the road, leaving behind the forest and its secrets. Carlos Valdez, the man he once was, had died that day in the forest. In his place emerged a murderer, a man capable of burying his own wife alive. The drive back home was a blur. Carlos drove on autopilot, his mind continuously replaying the events of the day. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ana's hand emerging from the earth, her fingers twitching in a last desperate attempt to survive. When he finally arrived home, the sun was already setting, the lights were on. The children must have been back from school. Carlos sat in the car for several minutes, taking deep breaths, preparing for the performance of his life. He entered the house, forcing a smile onto his face. "Dad!" shouted Sophia, his 10-year-old daughter, running to hug him. "Where's Mom?" Carlos felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Your mother, she had to leave on an urgent trip for work." Martin, his 14-year-old son, frowned. "A trip? But she didn't say anything this morning?" "It was last minute," Carlos improvised. "Very important. So much so that she couldn't say goodbye." "When will she be back?" Sophia asked, her eyes filled with innocent curiosity. Carlos swallowed hard. "I don't know, honey. It could take a while." That night, after putting the children to bed, Carlos sat in the kitchen with a bottle of whiskey. He drank directly from the bottle, trying to drown the guilt and horror that threatened to consume him. The phone rang, startling him. It was Maria, Ana's sister. "Carlos, is Ana with you? She's not answering my calls." Carlos closed his eyes, hating himself for the lie he was about to tell. "Maria, Ana is gone." "What do you mean she's gone?" "We had a fight. It was, it was horrible. I found out she was cheating on me. There was a gasp on the other end of the line. What? No, Anna would never do that. She did, Maria, with Miguel, my best friend. I saw them together. Oh my God. Carlos, I'm so sorry. But where's Anna now? I don't know. She took some things and left. Said she needed time to think. Maria was silent for a moment. This doesn't sound like Anna. She'd never just abandon the kids like that. I didn't think so either, but Carlos, are you sure she's okay? What if something happened to her? Carlos felt panic rising in his chest. I'm sure she's fine, Maria. She just needs time. After hanging up, Carlos stared at the phone. He knew this was only the beginning. Soon more people would start asking questions. The police would get involved. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, his hands shaking. What had he become? How had he gotten to this point? He remembered the moment he discovered Anna's infidelity. He'd arrived home early from work, hoping to surprise her. Instead, he was the one who was surprised when he found her in bed with Miguel. The pain and rage he felt at that moment were indescribable. But even then, he never imagined it would end like this. Carlos looked at his hands, the same hands that had dug Anna's grave, that had pushed her to her death. How could he live with himself after this? The sound of footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. Martín was at the kitchen door, looking at him with concern. Dad, are you okay? Carlos quickly wiped away the tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. Yes, son, I'm just worried about your mother. Martín came over and put a hand on his father's shoulder. She'll be back, right? Carlos felt a lump forming in his throat. I don't know, son. Things are complicated. What do you mean? What really happened? Carlos looked at his son, debating between truth and lie. He opted for a diluted version of the truth. Your mother made a mistake, a big one. Martín's eyes widened with understanding. She cheated on you, didn't she? No, Martin, it was the other way around. Martin recoiled, shaking his head. No, Mom would never do that. Son, sometimes the people we think we know. No, Martin shouted. You're lying. Mom loves us. Martin, please lower your voice. Your sister is asleep. I don't care. Where's Mom? I want to talk to her. Carlos stood up, trying to calm his son down. You can't. She's gone. I don't believe you. Mom would never leave us. At that moment, Sophia appeared at the door, rubbing her sleepy eyes. What's going on? Why are you shouting? Carlos looked at his children, feeling the weight of his lie crushing him. Nothing, honey. Go back to bed. I want Mommy, Sophia sobbed. Martin hugged her, shooting an accusing look at his father. Me too, Sophie. Me too. Carlos watched his children hug each other, crying for a mother who would never return. Guilt consumed him, threatening to make him confess right then and there. Kids, The doorbell interrupted him. The three looked at each other, surprised by the late visit. Stay here, Carlos ordered, heading for the door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with Miguel, his supposed best friend and Anna's lover. Where is Anna? Asked Miguel without preamble. Carlos felt his blood boil. How dare you come here? Miguel entered uninvited. I haven't been able to reach her all day. She's not answering my calls or messages. Keep your voice down, will you, Carlos? The kids are awake. I don't give a damn. Where is Anna? Carlos closed the door and faced Miguel. She's gone. She left us. Miguel stared at him incredulously. What? No, that's impossible. Anna would never cheat on you, because that's exactly what she did. With you. Miguel's face paled. Carlos, I'm sorry. We didn't mean for things to be like this. Didn't mean for things to be like this? Then how did you mean for things to be, Miguel? Were you planning to run away together? No, that's not it. It was a mistake. A mistake? Sleeping with my wife was a mistake? Carlos moved closer to Miguel, his voice low and dangerous. Carlos, please, I understand that you are angry, but... Angry? You have no idea how I feel, Miguel. At that moment, Martín appeared in the hallway. Uncle Miguel, what are you doing here? Miguel looked at Carlos, then at Martin. I came to look for your mother. Dad says she's gone. Martin said, his voice cracking. Says she abandoned us. Miguel stared at Carlos in horror. You told them that? Carlos stepped between Miguel and Martin. Miguel was just leaving, weren't you? No, I'm not leaving until you tell me where Ana is. I told you she left, Carlos shouted, pushing Miguel toward the door. You're lying, Miguel replied, resisting. Ana would never do that. The two men struggled at the entrance as Martin watched with a mixture of confusion and fear. Get out of my house, Carlos roared, finally managing to push Miguel outside. This isn't over, Carlos, Miguel yelled from the garden. I'm going to find out what happened to Ana. Carlos slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping. When he turned around, he saw Martin staring at him. Dad, Martin said, his voice trembling. What's really going on? Carlos slid to the floor, burying his face in his hands. Oh my God, what have I done? Martin knelt beside his father. Dad, you're scaring me. Please tell me the truth. Carlos looked up, his eyes filled with tears and despair. For a moment he considered confessing everything, but fear overcame guilt. Your mother betrayed us, Martin. With Uncle Miguel? Martin asked, his voice barely a whisper. Carlos nodded. I caught them together, and when I confronted them, she decided to leave. But why didn't she say goodbye? Why didn't she tell us anything? I guess she couldn't face us, Carlos lied, hating himself more and more. Martin sat down next to his father, resting his head on his shoulder. Do you think she'll come back? Carlos put an arm around his son, fighting back tears. I don't know, son. I don't know. They spent several minutes in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Martin spoke. Dad, what are we going to do now? Carlos looked at his son, seeing the same uncertainty and fear in his eyes that he felt. We're going to move on, Martin, together, as a family. But how? Without Mom? I know, son, it'll be hard, but we're strong. We have each other and Sophia. Martin nodded slowly. We'll tell Sophie the truth. Carlos closed his eyes, feeling the weight of all the lies he would have to maintain. Not now. She's too young to understand. Maybe when she's older. Okay, Martin said. I'll help you with Sophie. We'll tell her that Mom will be back soon. Carlos felt his heart break a little more, his son forced to grow up too fast, to carry a lie that he didn't even know the full extent of. Thank you, son, Carlos murmured. Now let's get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day. As they climbed the stairs, Carlos couldn't help but look back, almost expecting to see Ana walk through the door. But he knew that would never happen. Ana was dead, buried in the forest by his own hands. Carlos tucked Martin in and then went to check on Sophia. The girl was sleeping restlessly, clutching a photo of her mother. Carefully, Carlos took the photo from her and put it in the nightstand drawer. I'm sorry, my girl, he whispered, kissing Sophia's forehead. I'm so sorry. Finally, Carlos headed to his own room. He stopped at the door, unable to enter. Memories of Ana, of their life together, assaulted him. How could he sleep in the same bed where they once shared their love, where the betrayal had later taken place? Turning away, Carlos went back downstairs and headed for the couch. He lay down, staring at the ceiling, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily that night. In the darkness of the living room, Carlos went over the events of the day, the trip to the forest, the struggle, Ana's screams, the earth falling on top of her. A sob escaped his throat. How had he gotten to this point? How could he live with what he'd done? But as the weight of his crime threatened to crush him, Carlos knew he had no choice. For his children, for his family, he would have to move on. He would have to live with his secret, with the guilt, with the knowledge that he'd buried not only his wife, but also a part of himself in that forest. The clock read 3 a.m. when Carlos finally closed his eyes, falling into an uneasy sleep plagued by nightmares of hands emerging from the earth and muffled screams that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Sunlight streamed through the curtains as Carlos opened his eyes. For a moment, he forgot everything that had happened. Then reality hit him like a hammer. Ana, he murmured, sitting up on the couch. The silence of the house was deafening. Carlos looked at the clock. 7:15 a.m. Normally at this time, Ana would be making breakfast, singing softly as the children got ready for school. But Ana was gone, and she would never return. He stood up, his muscles protesting the night spent on the uncomfortable sofa. As he passed the hallway mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. Sunken eyes, stubble, the weight of a terrible secret etched into every wrinkle. "Dad?" Sophia's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Is Mom back?" Carlos felt his heart sink. "No, honey, Mom is still on her trip." "But when will she be back?" the girl insisted, her eyes full of hope. "I don't know, Sophie, but come on. We need to get ready for school." The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Anna's absence was a hole that seemed to grow with each passing day. One afternoon, as Carlos was trying to help Sophia with her math homework, the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Martin said closer to the door. Carlos heard voices and then Martin calling for him. "Dad, it's the police." He felt his blood run cold. With trembling steps, he made his way to the door. "Mr. Valdez," a police officer asked. "I'm Detective Ramirez. Can we speak with you for a moment?" Carlos nodded, unable to form words. "It's about your wife, Ana Valdez," the detective continued. "She's been reported missing." "Missing," Carlos managed to say, but she left us. She went on a trip." Detective Ramirez looked at him skeptically. "Mr. Valdez, according to our records, your wife has not used her passport, credit cards, or phone in the last 3 months. Can you explain that?" Carlos felt the ground shift beneath his feet. I don't know. We had a fight. She left. I thought she needed time. And it didn't strike you as strange that she didn't contact her children in all this time?" Carlos stammered, searching for a believable explanation. "Dad," Martin interrupted, "what's going on?" Detective Ramirez looked at the boy. "You're Martin. When was the last time you saw your mother?" Before Martin could answer, Carlos intervened. "Detective, I'd prefer you not question my children. If you have any more questions, we can speak privately." The detective nodded. "All right, Mr. Valdez, we'll need you to come to the station for a formal statement, and we'll probably want to speak with your children at some point." After the police left, Martin turned to his father. "Dad, what's really going on? Where's Mom?" Carlos sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of his lies. "Martin, it's complicated." "Stop saying that," Martin yelled. "I want the truth." "The truth is your mother abandoned us," Carlos shouted, surprising himself with the vehemence of his lie. "She left us, Martin. All of us." Martin recoiled, tears in his eyes. "I hate you," he whispered before running to his room. Carlos remained alone in the living room, the echo of his son's words ringing in his ears. The following days were a whirlwind of police interrogations, neighbor rumors, and accusing stares. Carlos felt like he was walking a tightrope. Each word, each gesture could make him fall. One night, as he was trying to sleep on the couch, he still couldn't enter the room he shared with Ana. He heard a noise in the kitchen. Upon investigating, he found Sophia sitting on the floor, surrounded by photos of Ana. "Sophie, what are you doing awake?" he asked softly. The girl looked up, her eyes red from crying. "I miss Mom," she sobbed. Carlos sat down next to her, hugging her. "I miss her too, honey." "Why did she leave us, Dad? Didn't she love us enough?" Carlos felt his heart break a little more. Every lie he told seemed to dig a deeper hole. "Sophia, look at me," he said, taking his daughter's face in his hands. "Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. Never doubt that." "Then why did she leave?" Sophia sobbed. Carlos closed his eyes, searching for the right words. "Sometimes adults make mistakes, terrible mistakes that hurt the people we love the most. But that doesn't mean we stop loving them." Sophia wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" The question hung heavy and painful in the air. Carlos knew the answer was no. Ana would never come back. But how could he tell his daughter that? "I don't know, honey," he finally replied. "But what I do know is that, whatever happens, we have each other. You, Martin, and I. We are a family." Sophia leaned in slowly and hugged her father. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, my girl," Carlos replied, fighting back tears. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Carlos sat on the back porch with a bottle of whiskey. The weight of his lies seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. "What am I doing, Ana?" he murmured into the night air. "How can I keep lying to them?" The silence of the night was his only answer. The months passed and the day came for Martin to leave for college. As he helped him pack, Carlos couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and fear. "Remember, son," he said as they closed the last suitcase, "college is for learning, not just for investigating Mom's disappearance," Martin finished. "I know, Dad. You've told me 1,000 times." Carlos sighed. "It's just that I worry about you. I don't want you to obsess over this." Martin sat down on the bed, looking at his father seriously. "Dad, is there something else you haven't told me about Mom?" Carlos felt his blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Martin replied, running a hand through his hair. "It's just that I sometimes feel like there's more to this story. Something doesn't add up." Carlos sat down next to his son, struggling to maintain his composure. "Martin, I've already told you everything I know. Your mother left us. It was painful, it was unfair, but it's the truth." Martin studied his father's face for a moment. "Are you sure? Because if there's something else, I need to know. I can't go to college with doubts." Carlos felt the weight of his secret crushing him. For a moment he considered confessing everything, telling Martin the truth about that terrible afternoon in the forest, but the fear of losing his son was stronger. "There's nothing else, son," he lied, hating himself for every word. "I promise you." Martin nodded slowly. "Okay, Dad, I believe you." The day of Martin's departure arrived too soon. As they said their goodbyes at the airport, Carlos hugged his son tightly. "Take care, okay?" he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I will, Dad," Martin replied. "And you take care of Sophia." Carlos watched his son disappear into the crowd, taking with him the promise to uncover the truth about his mother. He had never felt so alone. The following months were a challenge. Sophia, now in her final year of high school, became more withdrawn. Carlos struggled to hold his fractured family together as the weight of his secret threatened to crush him. One night, as they ate dinner in silence, Sophia dropped her fork with a clatter. "I can't take it anymore," she said, tears running down her cheeks. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay." Carlos put down his own cutlery. "Sophia, honey, don't tell me everything will be okay," she shouted. "Nothing is okay. Mom left, Martin left, and you don't even seem to care." Sophia's words were like a dagger to Carlos's heart. "How can you say that? Of course I care." "Really?" Sophia challenged. "Because you seem awfully happy to just move on as if Mom never existed." Carlos stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You have no idea what I'm going through." "Then tell me," Sophia yelled. "Tell me what's really going on." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Carlos looked at his daughter, seeing in her the same pain and confusion he felt. He could tell her the truth. He could confess the horrible crime he'd committed. "Sophia, there are things about your mother, about what happened, that you wouldn't understand." "Try me," Sophia challenged. "I'm not a little girl anymore, Dad. I can handle the truth." Carlos sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of years of lies. "The truth is that your mother didn't just leave us. At that moment the phone rang, interrupting Carlos's confession. With shaking hands he answered. "Hello?" "Mr. Valdez," said a familiar voice. "This is Detective Ramirez. We need you to come down to the station immediately." Carlos felt his blood run cold. "Has something happened?" "We've found new evidence in your wife's case," the detective replied. "It's urgent that we speak with you." Carlos looked at Sophia, who was watching him with a mix of confusion and worry. "I'll be there in half an hour," he said before hanging up. "Dad?" Sophia asked. "What's going on?" Carlos took a deep breath. "It was the police. They found something about your mother." Sophia's eyes widened with surprise and a flicker of hope. "They found her?" "I don't know, honey," Carlos replied, feeling the world crumble around him. "I have to go to the station." As he prepared to leave, Carlos couldn't stop thinking about how close he'd been to confessing everything. Was this a sign, an opportunity to finally tell the truth? Or worse, had they discovered his crime? His heart pounding frantically, Carlos headed to the station, knowing his life was about to change forever. The weight of his secret had never felt as heavy as it did at that moment, as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions from so many years ago. The clock at the police station read 10:15 p.m. when Carlos Valdez finally emerged from the interrogation room, his shirt soaked with sweat, his hands trembling. Detective Ramirez followed him to the door. "Mr. Valdez," she said, her voice professional but with a hint of compassion, "we understand this is difficult for you, but we need you to be completely honest with us." Carlos turned to her, his eyes weary and tormented. "I've already told you everything I know. Ana left. I haven't heard from her in 10 years. The detective stared at him as if she could see through his lies. "The new evidence suggests otherwise, Mr. Valdez. But for now, you can go home. We'll call if we need any more information." Carlos nodded mechanically and left the station. The cool night air hit him, bringing him back to reality. What new evidence had they found? Were they close to discovering the truth? Upon arriving home, he found Sophia waiting for him in the living room. "Dad," she said, jumping up. "What happened? Did they find Mom?" Carlos shook his head, sinking onto the couch. "No, honey, they just had some more questions." Sophia sat next to him, her eyes filled with worry. "Dad, what's really going on? I feel like there's something you're not telling me." Carlos looked at his daughter, now a young woman of 20, so much like Ana that it sometimes hurt to look at her. How could he keep lying to her? "Sophia, there are things about your mother, about what happened, that are complicated." "What do you mean?" Sophia asked, leaning forward. Carlos opened his mouth to speak, but at that moment his phone rang. It was a text from an unknown number. With shaking hands, he opened it. The world seemed to stop when he read the content. "The earth couldn't silence me, Carlos. I know what you did." Carlos dropped the phone as if it were burning. His face paled and he started to hyperventilate. "Dad!" Sophia called, alarmed. "What's wrong?" Carlos couldn't answer. His mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. How was this possible? Ana was dead. He'd buried her himself. Who could be sending this message? "Dad!" Sophia shouted, shaking him. "You're scaring me." Carlos blinked, focusing on his daughter. I'm sorry, Sophie. It's just, I got a strange text." "From who?" she asked, picking up the phone from the floor. "No," Carlos yelled, snatching the phone from her. "It's nothing. Probably just spam." Sophia looked at him suspiciously. "Dad, you're acting really weird. What's going on?" Carlos stood up, running a hand through his graying hair. "Nothing, honey. I'm tired. It's been a long day. I'm going to bed." Before Sophia could protest, Carlos went upstairs and locked himself in his room. He collapsed onto the bed, his mind racing. Who could have sent that message? Someone knew what he'd done, or he was losing his mind. The phone rang again. Heart pounding in his throat, Carlos looked at the screen. Another message from the same number. "The forest keeps secrets, Carlos, but I know them all." A sob escaped his throat. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. Suddenly, someone knocked on his bedroom door. "Dad," Sophia called. "Are you all right? I heard you crying." "I'm fine," Carlos replied, trying to control his voice. I just need to be alone." "Dad, please," Sophia insisted. "Let me in. I want to help you." Carlos looked at the door, then at the phone in his hand. What should he do? Confess? Continue to lie? Before he could decide, another message arrived. "Time's up, Carlos. You'll tell them, or I will." With trembling hands, Carlos opened the door. Sophia came in, her face a mask of worry. "Dad, what is going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Carlos sat down on the bed, feeling the weight of the world crushing him. "Sit down, Sophie. There's something I need to tell you." Sophia sat down next to him, taking his hand. "It's about Mom?" Carlos nodded slowly. "Yes, it's about what really happened 10 years ago." Just as he was about to speak, the doorbell rang. Carlos and Sophia looked at each other, surprised. "Who could that be at this hour?" Sophia asked. Carlos stood up, his heart pounding frantically. "I don't know. Stay here." He went downstairs slowly, each step heavy as lead. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with Detective Ramirez. "Mr. Valdez," she said, her expression serious. "I'm sorry to bother you at this hour, but new information has come to light. May we come in?" Carlos noticed then that the detective was not alone. Behind her was a man he didn't recognize. I guess," Carlos replied, opening the door wider. The detective and the man entered. Sophia came down the stairs, curious about the late visit. What's going on? She asked. Detective Ramirez glanced at Sophia, then at Carlos. Mr. Valdez, can we speak privately? Carlos nodded mechanically. Sophia, please go to your room. No, Sophia said firmly. No more secrets, Dad. I want to know what's going on. Detective Ramirez exchanged a look with the man who accompanied her. Very well, Mr. Valdez. This is Dr. Jimenez. He's an expert in soil analysis and forensic botany. Carlos felt his blood run cold. Forensic botany? Dr. Jimenez stepped forward. Mr. Valdez, we've been analyzing soil samples from several wooded areas nearby. We found something unusual. What did you find? Carlos asked, his voice barely a whisper. Evidence of human decomposition, Dr. Jimenez replied, and traces of DNA that match your wife's. Sophia gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. What? But that means... Your mother is dead, Detective Ramirez finished softly, and her body was buried in the woods. Carlos staggered, leaning against the wall to keep from falling. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. Dad, Sophia said, her voice trembling. What's going on? What did you do? Before Carlos could answer, his phone rang again. With shaking hands, he pulled it out of his pocket. Another message from the unknown number. Time's up, Carlos. The truth always comes out. Carlos dropped the phone, which clattered to the floor. Detective Ramirez quickly picked it up. Mr. Valdez, she said, her voice now firm and authoritative. I need you to hand over your phone, and I need you to tell us exactly what happened 10 years ago. Carlos looked around, at the accusing faces of the detective and the doctor, at the expression of horror and betrayal on Sophia's face. He knew the time had come. There was no escape. I killed her, he whispered. I killed Anna. The silence that followed his confession was deafening. Sophia recoiled, shaking her head in denial. No, she said. No, it's not true. Tell me it's not true, Dad. Carlos dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, Sophie. I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking. I was so angry, so hurt. So hurt that you killed Mom? Sophia interrupted, her voice trembling with rage. You robbed us of our mother. Sophia, please, Carlos begged. I know what I did is unforgivable, but... You're right, Sophia yelled. It is unforgivable. I hate you. I hate you for what you did. With those words, Sophia turned and ran, leaving Carlos alone with his guilt and remorse. Hours later, the cell door opened. Detective Ramirez entered, followed by Martin. Carlos looked up, seeing his son for the first time in months. Martin was pale, with dark circles under his eyes and an expression of deep sadness on his face. Martin, Carlos whispered, standing up slowly. Son, don't call me that, Martin interrupted, his voice cold as ice. I'm not your son anymore. Detective Ramirez stepped in. Mr. Valdez, your son has requested to speak with you. I'll be here to supervise the conversation. Carlos nodded, unable to take his eyes off Martin. Why, son? Why the messages? Martin let out a bitter laugh. You really have to ask? 10 years, Dad. 10 years of lies, of pretending you didn't know anything. Do you have any idea what it was like to grow up like that, wondering every day what happened to Mom? I'm sorry, Carlos murmured. I never wanted things to be like this. Didn't want? You didn't want to kill Mom? Or you didn't want us to find out? Carlos sank down onto the cell bench, burying his face in his hands. I don't know, Martin. I don't know. Well, I do know, Martin said, stepping closer to the bars. I know that I spent the last 5 years of my life investigating Mom's disappearance. I know that every clue, every piece of evidence, led me back to you. And I know that when I finally discovered the truth, my world fell apart. How? Carlos asked, looking up. How did you find out? Martin pulled an envelope from his jacket and handed it through the bars. With this. Carlos opened the envelope, his hands shaking. Inside were a series of aerial photographs of the forest where he'd buried Anna. Satellite image analysis, Martin explained. I showed abnormal growth patterns in the vegetation, consistent with a buried body. Carlos felt his stomach churn. My God. Don't invoke God now, Martin said scornfully. Not after what you did. Detective Ramirez, who had been observing silently, stepped in. Martin, I understand your pain, but I need to ask you, why the messages? Why didn't you come directly to us with this evidence? Martin looked at the detective, then at his father. I wanted him to confess. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the fear and anguish that Mom must have felt. I wanted him to suffer. Carlos looked up, his eyes filled with tears. You succeeded, son. I've been suffering since the day I did what I did. It's not enough, Martin said, his voice breaking. It will never be enough. At that moment, hurried footsteps could be heard in the hallway. Sophia appeared, gasping, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Martin, she cried, running towards her brother. It's true? You sent the messages. Martin embraced his sister, nodding silently. Sophia pulled away, looking at her brother, then at her father. How could you? How could you do this to us? Sophie, Carlos began. I'm the only one to blame here. Martin only. Don't, Sophia interrupted. Don't you dare defend him. You killed Mom, and he played with our minds. You both lied to us. Martin tried to take his sister's hand. Sophia, please, I had to do it. I had to find out the truth. Sophia recoiled. At what cost, Martin? To destroy what little was left of our family? Detective Ramirez intervened again. I understand this is difficult for everyone, but we need to process both of you. Mr. Valdez, you will be charged with first-degree murder, Martin with obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. What? Sophia exclaimed. You can't arrest Martin. He was only trying to help. I'm sorry, the detective said, but the law is clear. Martin withheld critical information in a murder case. Carlos stood up, approaching the bars. No, he said firmly. Detective, Martin is not to blame. I forced him to keep quiet. I threatened him. Martin stared at his father in surprise. What are you doing? The right thing, for once, Carlos replied. Then turning to the detective, I have a full confession to make about Anna's murder and about how I manipulated my children into keeping quiet. Detective Ramirez looked at Carlos skeptically. Mr. Valdez, are you sure about this? Completely, Carlos replied. I will write and sign a detailed confession, but on one condition, that you leave my children alone. They are victims in all of this. Sophia and Martin exchanged looks of confusion and surprise. Dad, Sophia began, what are you doing? Carlos looked at his children, a sad smile on his face. What I should have done 10 years ago, protect you. Detective Ramirez nodded slowly. Very well, Mr. Valdez, we will take your statement, but I can't promise anything about the charges against your son until the district attorney reviews the case. I understand, Carlos said, then looking at his children. Martin, Sophia, I'm sorry for everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope that someday you can find peace. Martin stepped forward, his eyes filled with conflicting emotions. Dad, you don't have to do this. I do, Carlos interrupted. I've lived with this guilt for too long. It's time to face the consequences. Sophia, tears in her eyes, approached the bars. Dad, I hate you for what you did, but I also love you. You're my father. Carlos reached his hand through the bars, gently touching his daughter's cheek. I know, honey, and I love both of you more than you can ever imagine. Detective Ramirez cleared her throat. It's time, Mr. Valdez. We need to take your statement. Carlos nodded, taking one last look at his children before following the detective. As he was led away, he heard Sophia sobbing and Martin comforting her. In the interrogation room, Carlos sat down in front of a pad of paper and a pen. Detective Ramirez observed him from across the table. Start from the beginning, Mr. Valdez, she said, and don't leave anything out. Carlos took a deep breath and began to write. My name is Carlos Valdez, and 10 years ago, I killed my wife, Anna. As the words flowed, Carlos felt like a weight was lifting off his shoulders. The truth buried for so long was finally coming to light. And although he knew he would spend the rest of his life in prison, for the first time in a decade, he felt like he could breathe. Outside in the hallway of the station, Martin and Sophia hugged each other, united in their pain and confusion. What are we going to do now? Sophia whispered. Martin tightened his embrace. I don't know, Sophie, but we'll do it together. As the siblings comforted each other, the sun began to peek over the horizon. A new day was dawning, bringing with it the promise of truth, justice, and maybe someday healing. In the interrogation room, Carlos ended his confession with one last line. To my children, Martin and Sophia, I'm sorry for everything. I hope that someday you can find it in your hearts to forgive me, even though I will never be able to forgive myself. He signed the document and handed it to Detective Ramirez. She quickly read it over, nodding gravely. Mr. Valdez, she said finally, this is a full confession to first-degree murder. Do you understand the consequences of what you have written here? Carlos nodded. I do, Detective, and I'm ready to face them. The detective stood up. Very well. You will be transferred to the state penitentiary to await trial. You have the right to an attorney. Do you wish us to call someone for you? Carlos shook his head. No, thank you. I only wish to say goodbye to my children, if that's possible. The detective considered him for a moment before nodding. I'll give you 5 minutes. They led Carlos back to the cell area, where Martin and Sophia were still waiting. As they saw him, they both approached the bars. Dad, Martin began, his voice cracking. Why did you do it? Why did you confess everything? Carlos looked at his children, a sad smile on his face. Because it was time to tell the truth. You deserve to be able to move on with your lives without the weight of my lies. Sophia, Carlos said gently, look at me. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. Never doubt that. Then why did she leave? Sophia sobbed. Carlos closed his eyes, searching for the right words. Sometimes adults make mistakes, terrible mistakes that hurt the people we love the most. But that doesn't mean we stop loving them. Sophia wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Do you think she'll ever come back? The question hung heavy and painful in the air. Carlos knew the answer was no. Anna would never come back. But how could he tell his daughter that? I don't know, honey, he finally replied. But what I do know is that whatever happens, we have each other. You, Martin, and I. We are a family. Sophia leaned in slowly and hugged her father. I love you, Dad. I love you too, my girl, Carlos replied, fighting back tears. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Carlos sat on the back porch with a bottle of whiskey. The weight of his lies seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. What am I doing, Anna? He murmured into the night air. How can I keep lying to them? The silence of the night was his only answer. The months passed and the day came for Martin to leave for college. As he helped him pack, Carlos couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and fear. Remember, son, he said as they closed the last suitcase, college is for learning, not just for investigating Mom's disappearance, Martin finished. I know, Dad. You've told me 1,000 times. Carlos sighed. It's just that I worry about you. I don't want you to obsess over this. Martin sat down on the bed, looking at his father seriously. Dad, is there something else you haven't told me about Mom? Carlos felt his blood run cold. What do you mean? I don't know, Martin replied, running a hand through his hair. It's just that I sometimes feel like there's more to this story. Sophia, with tears in her eyes, asked, What's going to happen now? I'll go to prison, Sophie, Carlos replied gently. Probably for the rest of my life. But you have to move on. Live your lives, be happy. How? Sophia sobbed. How can we be happy after all of this? Carlos reached his hands through the bars, taking his children's hands in his own. By finding strength in each other, by honoring your mother's memory, and maybe someday finding it in your hearts to forgive. Martin squeezed his father's hand. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you for what you did to Mom, but thank you for telling the truth in the end. Carlos nodded, tears streaming down his face. I love you, kids, more than you can ever imagine, and I'm sorry for everything. Detective Ramirez stepped closer. It's time, Mr. Valdez. Carlos released his children's hands, taking a step back. Take care of each other, he said, and remember, despite everything, your mother loved you, and I love you too. As they led him away, Carlos took one last look at his children. Martin was holding Sophia, both crying silently. The weight of 10 years of lies and secrets had finally been lifted, but the road to healing had only just begun. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, a new day in full swing. For Carlos, it was the end of a life of deceit and the beginning of one of atonement. For Martin and Sophia, it was the start of a journey toward truth, acceptance, and maybe someday, forgiveness. The truth, buried for so long, had finally come to light. And although the price had been high, the liberation it brought was undeniable. The message that had driven Carlos to the brink of madness had served its purpose. The truth, however painful, had finally been revealed. The echo of Martin's footsteps echoed down the cold hallway of the state penitentiary. It had been 6 months since his father's confession, and this was the first time he'd dared to visit. He stopped in front of the door to the visitation room, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the knob. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked the guard beside him. Martin nodded, unable to form words. The guard opened the door, and there was Carlos, sitting on the other side of a metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. "Son," Carlos said, his voice cracking with emotion. Martin sat down slowly, studying his father's face. Carlos had aged years in just a few months. His hair was now completely gray, deep wrinkles etched into his face. "I'm not your son," Martin replied coldly. "Not after what you did." Carlos looked down. "I know, and I understand. Thank you for coming." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of doors clanging shut and guards barking orders. Finally, Martin spoke. "Why did you do it?" Carlos looked up, confused. "You know, I told you everything in my confession." "No," Martin interrupted. "I don't mean why you killed Mom. I mean, why did you confess? Why did you decide to tell the truth after all these years?" Carlos sighed deeply. "Because it was the right thing to do. Because you deserve to know the truth." searching for the truth. Martin tightened his embrace. And look where that got us. Maybe it would have been better not to know. Sophia pulled away, looking at him incredulously. How can you say that? Mom deserved justice. I know, Martin said, rubbing his tired eyes. It's just that sometimes I wish we could go back to when we were happy. But were we really happy? Sophia asked. Or were we just living a lie? Before Martin could answer, the doorbell rang. The siblings exchanged a confused look before Martin stood up to answer it. Standing on the threshold was Miguel, their father's former best friend and the man with whom their mother had had an affair. What are you doing here? Martin asked, his voice cold. Miguel looked uncomfortable. I wanted to see how you were doing. It's been months since... Well, you know, we're fine, Martin replied curtly. You can go now, please. I just want to talk, Miguel said. Sophia appeared behind Martin. Let him in, she said quietly. Martin looked at her in surprise but stepped aside. Miguel entered, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on the family photos that still hung on the walls. What do you want, Miguel? Martin asked, folding his arms. Miguel sat down on the armchair, his posture tense. I wanted to apologize for my part in all of this. Sophia sat down across from him, while Martin remained standing, watchful. Your part? Sophia asked. You mean sleeping with our mother? Miguel winced at the bluntness of the words. Yes, that was a terrible mistake. A mistake that cost our mother her life, Martin snapped. I know, Miguel said, his voice cracking, and I'll live with that guilt for the rest of my life. Guilt? Sophia asked. Did you know what Dad had done? Miguel shook his head vehemently. No, I swear. I never imagined Carlos would be capable of that. But you suspected something, didn't you? Martin pressed. Miguel looked down. I had my doubts, but I wanted to believe that Anna had simply left, that maybe she was with me somewhere. Sophia let out a choked sob. And it never occurred to you to say anything? Martin asked, his voice filled with contempt. You never thought about us? About two kids who'd lost their mother? I'm sorry, Miguel said, tears forming in his eyes. I was a coward. I should have done more. Yes, you should have, Martin replied. But you didn't, Sophia said. And now it's too late. A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Sophia spoke. Did you love her? Miguel looked up, surprised by the question. Yes, I did. Then why didn't you fight for her? Sophia asked, her voice trembling. Why did you leave her with Dad if you knew she wasn't happy? Miguel looked devastated. Because she didn't want to leave you. You, her children, were the most important thing to her. Martin let out a bitter laugh. And look how we repaid her. One killed her, and the other took 10 years to find out the truth. Don't say that, Sophia intervened. It wasn't your fault, Martin. It wasn't, Martin asked, his voice breaking. I studied criminology. I obsessed over missing persons cases, and yet I couldn't see what was right in front of me. Miguel stood up, approaching Martin. Don't blame yourself. Carlos, your father, was very clever. He knew how to cover his tracks. Martin backed away. Don't call him that. He's not my father. Not after what he did. I understand, Miguel said, but you need to know that none of this is your fault, not yours or Sophia's. Whose fault is it then? Sophia asked. Yours, Dad's? Mom's? Miguel sighed deeply. I suppose we all have our share of blame. Me for starting the affair, Anna for, well, and Carlos for his reaction. A reaction that ended with our mother dead. Martin snapped. I know, Miguel said, and there's nothing I can say to change that. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that if you ever need anything at all, I'm here. Martin looked at him with contempt. Now you want to help? After 10 years? Martin, Sophia intervened softly. I think we should listen to him. Martin looked at his sister incredulously. You're on his side? I'm not on anyone's side, Sophia replied. But we need answers, and maybe Miguel can give us some. Miguel nodded. Ask things easier. But at least now we understand a little more. Miguel nodded. I'm sorry for everything. I wish I could change things. But you can't, Martin said, getting up. Nobody can. What's done is done. What are you going to do now? Miguel asked. Martin and Sophia exchanged a look. We don't know, Sophia replied. I guess try to move on somehow. If you need anything, Miguel began. We know, Martin interrupted. Thank you for coming, Miguel, but I think it's time for you to go. Miguel nodded, understanding the hint. He stood up and headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned back one last time. Your mother loved you more than anything in the world. Never forget that. With those words, he left, leaving Martin and Sophia alone with their thoughts and mixed emotions. Sophia was the first to break the silence. What are we going to do, Martin? How do we move on after this? Martin sat down beside his sister, putting an arm around her shoulders. I don't know, Sophie, but we'll do it together. It's what Mom would have wanted. Sophia nodded, resting her head on her brother's shoulder. Do you think we'll ever be able to forgive Dad? Or Miguel? Or Mom? Martin sighed deeply, closing his eyes for a moment. I don't know, Sophie. Forgiveness is complicated, especially in a situation like this. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Martin spoke again. You know, for years I imagined 1,000 different scenarios of what could have happened to Mom. But never, not even in my worst nightmares, did I think that Dad would be capable of... His voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Sophia hugged him tighter. I know, she whispered. Me neither. I always thought he was the perfect dad, the perfect husband. And now we know that he was human, Martin finished. Flawed, making mistakes, just like everyone else. Sophia sat up, looking her brother in the eyes. But that doesn't excuse what Dad did, right? Martin shook his head vehemently. No, of course not. Nothing can excuse that. Then why, Sophia asked, her voice cracking, why do I feel this confusion? Why does a part of me want to understand Dad? Want to forgive him? Martin took his sister's hands in his own. Because he's our dad, Sophie, despite everything. He's the man who raised us, who loved us. It's natural to feel conflicted. But he's also a murderer, Sophia said, tears streaming down her cheeks. He killed our mother. How can I even consider forgiving him? Martin ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with his own emotions. I don't know if forgiveness is something we can give now or ever. But what I do know is that we can't let this consume us. Sophia nodded slowly. But how? How do we move on? One day at a time, Martin replied, and together, we're all we have left. At that moment, Martin's phone rang. He looked at the screen and frowned. Who is it? Sophia asked. It's Detective Ramirez, Martin replied, his voice tense. He answered the call, putting it on speaker. Hello, Martin, said the detective's voice. I'm sorry to bother you, but I have news that I think you should hear. Sophia and Martin exchanged a worried look. What is it, Detective? Martin asked. We've found your mother's remains, the detective said, her voice soft but professional. At the location your father indicated in his confession. Sophia let out a choked sob. Martin hugged her instinctively, struggling to find his voice. I understand, he finally managed to say. What happens now? We'll need one of you to come down to formally identify the remains, the detective replied. I know this is difficult, but it's a necessary step in the process. Martin closed his eyes, trying to control his emotions. I'll do it. No, Sophia interrupted. You don't have to go through that. I want to go, she insisted. I need to see her, to say goodbye. Detective Ramirez sighed audibly. I understand. If you're sure you can come down tomorrow at 10 a.m. to the coroner's office. Do you need me to send someone to pick you up? No, thank you, Martin replied. We can get there on our own. the one who's been raising us all these years. Maybe he has a right to know. Martin stood up abruptly, walking to the window. Right? What rights does a murderer have, Sophia? I know, Sophia said, her voice barely a whisper. It's just that all of this is so confusing. A part of me hates him for what he did. But another part what? Martin pressed, turning to look at her. Another part remembers the dad who read us bedtime stories, Sophia replied, tears welling up in her eyes. The dad who taught me to ride a bike, who helped you with your science projects? How can he be the same person? Martin sank back onto the couch, the weight of his sister's words crashing down on him. I don't know, Sophie. I guess people are more complicated than we think. They sat in silence for a long time, each lost in their memories and conflicted emotions. Finally, Martin spoke again. Tomorrow will be a hard day. We should try to get some rest. Sophia nodded, standing up slowly. Before going to her room, she turned back to her brother. Martin, promise me something. Anything, Sophie. Promise me that no matter what happens tomorrow, we'll stay together through this. You won't leave me alone. Martin walked over to his sister, hugging her tightly. I promise, Sophie. We're in this together. To the end. That night, neither of them got much sleep. The memories of their mother, mixed with the horrible reality of her death, kept them awake until dawn. The next morning, they got ready in silence to go to the coroner's office. Just as they were about to leave, Sophia took Martin's hand. Wait, she said. I think we should call Dad. Tell him they found Mom. Martin looked at her, surprised. Are you sure? Sophia nodded slowly. Yes, not for him, but for us. We need to close this chapter, Martin, and that includes facing Dad one last time. Martin considered his sister's words for a moment before nodding. You're right. We'll call him. From the car. As they drove to the coroner's office, Martin dialed the number for the prison. After several minutes of waiting and being transferred, he finally heard his father's voice. Martin? Carlos said, his voice a mixture of surprise and hope. Dad, Martin replied, his voice cold. Sophia and I wanted you to know that they found Mom's body. We're going to identify her now. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Carlos finally spoke, his voice broken with emotion. Thank you for telling me. I know you didn't have to. We didn't do it for you, Martin interrupted. We did it for us, for Mom. I understand, Carlos said softly. I'm sorry. For everything. Your apologies don't change anything, Dad, Martin said, closing his eyes, fighting back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. They don't bring Mom back. I know, Carlos replied, but it's all I can offer now. That and my love for you. Although I know I don't deserve it. Sophia, Carlos said gently, look at me. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. Never doubt that. Then why did she leave? Sophia sobbed. Carlos closed his eyes, searching for the right words. Sometimes adults make mistakes. Terrible mistakes that hurt the people we love the most. But that doesn't mean we stop loving them. Sophia wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Do you think she'll ever come back? The question hung heavy and painful in the air. Carlos knew the answer was no. Anna would never come back. But how could he tell his daughter that? I don't know, honey, he finally replied. But what I do know is that, whatever happens, we have each other. You, Martin, and I. We are a family. Sophia leaned in slowly and hugged her father. I love you, Dad. I love you too, my girl, Carlos replied, fighting back tears. Sophia, who had been listening silently,